It begins in silence, a silence so complete it feels alive, pressing against the walls, seeping through concrete, hanging in the stale air of a prison built to erase hope. It is the night of July 11th, 2015. Inside the Altiplano maximum security prison in Mexico, the corridors are long and dim, washed in the harsh hum of fluorescent lights. Their pale glow gives the impression of a place that is neither day nor night, but some suspended purgatory in between. Metal doors stand locked like iron lungs. Guards patrol with the weary rhythm of men convinced that their fortress is unbreakable. Beyond these routines, there is nothing. Only the echo of boots striking the floor, the occasional cough from behind a door, and the steady hum of electricity in the wires overhead. And yet, beneath this carefully constructed stillness, something is moving, far below the ground, past the concrete foundations and into the belly of the earth. There is another rhythm, subtle, hidden, impossible to hear from the surface. A muted knock, a faint vibration, the sound of earth being pried away, soil shifting under hands and tools. Swallowed by darkness, up above, in cell number 20, sits Joaquín Guzmán Loera, better known to the world as El Chapo. His frame is small, unremarkable, the kind of body that disappears into shadows. To the guards, he is quiet, even docile. A prisoner in his late 50s, serving out what should have been a lifetime sentence in one of the most fortified prisons in the country. But appearances deceive. For El Chapo, silence has always been the perfect disguise. On this night, he paces his cell slowly. The bed is neatly made. The sink gleams with institutional sterility. The air is heavy with disinfectant and dust. A small television hums softly, flickering images into the room. Nothing suggests rebellion, nothing hints at escape. Yet beneath the floor, a miracle of human audacity inches closer. The tunnel is almost complete. 1 mile long, stretching from a modest house outside the prison walls directly beneath this cell. It is lit with electric lamps, reinforced with wooden beams, ventilated with crude engineering, and fitted with a small rail sistema, hidden artery carved into the Mexican earth. The construction of this tunnel is not just a feat of logistics. It is a philosophy. For El Chapo, tunnels are more than passageways. They are metaphors for survival. They are the veins of a secret empire, the silent paths that allow movement when the surface world is too hostile, too visible, too dangerous, and now, once again. The earth has opened for him. At precisely the right moment, he kneels on the floor of his cell. A square of concrete, carefully cut and disguised, lifts away like the lid of a secret chest. Beneath it, a void yawns open. The tunnel is waiting. Without hesitation, El Chapo descends into the earth. Swallowed by the silence he has cultivated his entire life. Above ground, the prison remains calm. Guards walk their rounds. Cameras capture nothing but emptiness. Hours pass before anyone realizes the cell is vacant, that the most wanted man in Mexico has vanished once again, this time into the soil itself. It is tempting to see this escape as an isolated miracle, a single act of audacity. But to understand it, we must go deeper. For the tunnel was not just a hole in the ground. It was a reflection of the man who used it. Joaquín Guzmán had built his life like this passageway, hidden, patient, silent, and relentless. The world would later marvel at the scale of the engineering, at the precision with which the tunnel emerged exactly beneath his shower area, at the sheer courage required to carry it out under the noses of the state. But for El Chapo, it was the most natural expression of who he was. His life, from the very beginning, had been a series of tunnels, unseen paths carved through poverty, through danger, through power, always underground, always in silence. And so, before we know him as the drug lord, the fugitive, the world's most wanted man, we must first know him as something else, the master of silence, the shadow that lives beneath the earth. This is where his story begins, not with the sound of gunfire, not with the clash of armies, but with a knock beneath the soil, a faint, almost invisible rhythm that only those who listen carefully can hear. The earth itself became his ally. Its weight concealed him. Its silence protected him. Its darkness mirrored the world he built, a world where power flowed unseen, where roads were not highways but tunnels, where empires were not displayed but hidden beneath the surface. In this opening scene, we are invited to descend with him, not into a literal tunnel, but into the long subterranean story of his life, a story of shadows and silence, of poverty and ambition, of empire and exile. As listeners, we feel the air grow cooler, the walls press closer, the sound of dripping water echo faintly in the distance. We are stepping not only into a tunnel, but into a life defined by the refusal to remain above ground, exposed, and yet there is an irony in this silence. For every tunnel dug, every escape achieved, every shadow embraced, there is always a reckoning waiting at the surface. Silence can shield, but it can also suffocate. The earth that conceals can also bury. Thus El Chapo disappears into the underground passage on that summer night in 2015. We are left with a haunting paradox. Has he once again achieved freedom? Or is he only sinking deeper into the inevitable collapse of his empire? This question lingers in the air as the scene fades. The hum of prison lights continues above, oblivious. The tunnel stretches onward, an artery of shadow, leading not just to freedom but into the labyrinth of a man's life. We close the chapter as we began with silence, but now it is a silence charged with meaning, heavy with foreshadowing. The knock beneath the earth has been heard, and from it begins the story of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the Tunnel King. The story drifts backward, far from the concrete corridors of Altiplano, into a place where the earth itself seemed older than memory. It is the 1950s, and in the rugged folds of the Sierra Madre Mountains of Sinaloa, a boy named Joaquín Guzmán Lora is born. Later, the world would know him as El Chapo, the short one. But in these years, he is only a child, a small figure surrounded by a vast and punishing land. The Sierra does not forgive weakness. Its ridges rise like broken teeth against the horizon, jagged, immense, and silent. Thin air drifts down from the peaks, carrying with it the scent of pine, of dust, of distant fires lit to warm families who huddle in homes built of adobe and tin. Roofs groan beneath the weight of storms, floors remain hard-packed earth. This is not a place of comfort, but of survival. Every breath, every step is bound to the rhythm of scarcity. The soil is stingy. Corn grows only in patches, beans even less. And so men turn to another crop, one that blooms scarlet against the hillsides. Like spilled blood poppies, the petals shimmer in the light, fragile yet dangerous. In their sap lies opium, a path that promises more than the mountains can otherwise give. For Joaquín, childhood was shaped by the sight of those fields. His father, a man tied to both subsistence farming and the temptations of narcotics, carried himself with the weary posture of someone who knew hunger too well. The family scraped by on little, beans boiled thin, tortillas stretched to fill bellies. Yet when the poppies thrived, there was a brief breath of relief money to buy shoes, to mend a roof, to live a little closer to dignity. But poppies could not erase hardship. They brought risk as much as survival. Soldiers sometimes arrived, burning the fields, punishing those who dared to coax wealth from the forbidden flower. Neighbors vanished into prisons, some never to return. And so a boy learned quickly that silence was a shield. To speak too much was to invite danger. To watch quietly, to observe, to measure people without revealing himself. This became Joaquín's first education. In the evenings, smoke drifted from cooking fires, curling through the mountain air. The smell of beans, the acrid bite of wood, the faint sweetness of boiled maize filled the narrow homes. Children pressed close to warmth. Outside, the stars were so sharp they seemed to pierce the sky itself. These were moments of small beauty, yet beneath them ran a steady current of tension. Poverty was not just lack. It was a weight pressing on the chest, a reminder that the world outside these mountains might offer something more or nothing at all. The Sierra was a paradox, both shield and trap. Its isolation protected, keeping intruders at bay, yet it confined its children to its hunger. For Joaquín, the mountains were a fortress of stone and silence, but they also whispered possibilities. Hidden paths wound through valleys, routes known only to locals. With enough knowledge, enough daring, one could move unseen. The land itself seemed to offer lessons how to endure, how to vanish, how to survive when the world was stacked against you. Joaquín was small in stature, but sharp in observation. He noticed things, the way men bartered quietly in corners, the way his mother stretched what little food she had, the way soldiers carried themselves with a kind of careless authority. Every detail mattered. In this environment, awareness was not a luxury. It was survival. Neighbors would later remember him as a boy with restless energy, one who hated being idle. When crops failed, he sold oranges, carrying them into nearby towns. When the land offered nothing, he searched for odd work, always moving, always trying, always pushing against the edges of limitation. Hunger is a teacher, and it taught him discipline. It taught him that a man who waited would be consumed by the mountain, but a man who sought could carve a path forward. The rhythms of his youth were marked by scarcity and secrecy, the crunch of boots on dry soil, the rustle of wind through brittle maize stalks, the silence of adults when certain topics arose. These were the sounds of his childhood, blending into a kind of music that only those mountains could play. Yet poverty also instilled in him something else, ambition. To live with nothing is to dream of more. To see wealth appear and vanish through the veins of opium was to recognize the fragility of stability, the way fortune could slip through fingers like dust. The boy who walked those stony paths began to imagine a different life, though he could not yet name it. A life where he would not bend beneath the mountain's weight, where he would not hide from soldiers, where he would not fear hunger at the table. But ambition born in hardship rarely comes gentle. It festers, it sharpens, it waits. Joaquín's mountains planted in him the skills he would one day perfect: patience, secrecy, endurance, and an instinct for paths unseen by others. The Sierra Madre was his first teacher, its lessons carved into his bones like stone cut by wind. As the chapter of his childhood closes, one truth becomes clear: geography births destinies. The land that raised him was harsh, but it gave him the tools he needed to rise. The Sierra's valleys taught him to hide. Its ridges taught him to endure. Its silence taught him to listen, and in the crimson bloom of its poppies, he glimpsed both the chains of his origins and the keys to his escape. In time, the boy from the mountains would leave. He would follow those hidden paths into the wider world, carrying with him the knowledge that everything begins in the earth. Hunger, silence, and the seeds of power. The 1970s arrived quietly in Sinaloa. The world beyond the mountains seemed far away, a place of highways and neon lights, of cities that pulsed with a rhythm unknown to the villagers scattered along the Sierra. But for the young Joaquín Guzmán Laura, the distance between his world and that wider one was beginning to shrink. Hidden paths carved into rock and soil became arteries leading toward a trade that would soon envelop Mexico. He began, as so many did, small, unnoticed, carrying what others could not or would not. Packages of marijuana, bundles of opium gum, sticky and pungent, wrapped tightly in plastic. He was a mule in the most literal sense, hauling, transporting, obeying. At first, it was work like any other, a means of survival. But, unlike most, Joaquín did not see it as a passing chance. He treated each delivery as if it were a lesson. He watched the men who gave him orders, studying the way they spoke, the way they concealed their intentions, the way they calculated risk with eyes that seemed to weigh not only money but fate itself. His earliest associations were with local traffickers, men hardened by both poverty and ambition. Among them was Pedro Avilés, one of the first to organize the smuggling of marijuana into the United States. Avilés understood that the land itself was not enough, that opportunity lay across borders, hidden inside vehicles, shielded by bribes, carried like shadows through the desert. For a boy raised in the mountains, Avilés was both distant and magnetic. He represented what survival looked like when transformed into power. Joaquín learned quickly. He was not loud. He did not boast. Where others demanded recognition, he worked silently, carrying out tasks with the precision of someone who knew that mistakes were not simply errors, but invitations to death. If he was told to deliver by dawn, he delivered by dawn. If weather threatened, if soldiers blocked the way, he found routes others overlooked. It was this dependability, this quiet certainty that marked him early. People began to say that Guzmán was a man who never failed. In the shadows of this trade, reliability was rare. Violence was easy, corruption was common, but consistency, this was a rarer strength. Joaquín's name spread not with noise, but with whispers. He was punctual. He ensured shipments moved when others faltered. He kept accounts in order. He understood, instinctively, that trust was not a matter of friendship, but of necessity. And so he carved for himself a reputation that made him valuable. The 1980s brought a deeper shift. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather, was consolidating power. He was no mere smuggler. He was an architect, shaping the scattered operations of Mexico into something resembling a single organization. From Guadalajara, his influence stretched across states and borders, weaving alliances with Colombians, negotiating with officials, calculating every movement with the patience of a chess player. For Joaquín, this was apprenticeship in its truest sense. He entered into the orbit of Gallardo's empire, still a subordinate, but now moving within circles that would one day define him. Here he witnessed how logistics became empire. Airstrips hidden in valleys, pilots flying under radar, convoys moving across states with military precision. Money flowed not as coins, but as rivers, turning men into kings or corpses depending on how it was handled. And through it all, Joaquín remained quiet. He was not flamboyant. He did not dress to impress. He did not command attention at gatherings. He was small, almost forgettable, and yet his presence carried weight. Those who observed him noticed his eyes, alert and watchful, scanning, absorbing. He spoke little, but when he did, it was direct, without flourish. He carried himself not as one trying to prove his worth, but as one certain that worth was best shown in results. Apprenticeship is often misunderstood. It is not only about learning skills, it is about learning silence, restraint, patience. In these years, Joaquín mastered invisibility. He saw how Gallardo navigated officials, bribing with one hand and threatening with the other. He saw how shipments were divided, how alliances were made fragile by greed, how trust could crumble with the faintest crack. These were not lessons written in books. They were learned in shadows, spoken in whispers, and remembered by those who survived. Yet even as he served, he dreamed. The boy from the Sierra still carried within him the hunger born of poverty. Each journey, each transaction, each successful delivery planted in him the certainty that he could one day command more than errands, that he could shape his own network, build his own corridors, command his own silence. He did not yet have wings, but he felt them forming. His rise was not dramatic, not marked by sudden coups or loud declarations. It was steady, invisible, a momentum gathering like water pressing against stone. Men began to trust him with more. Larger shipments, more delicate negotiations, routes that required cunning. Each success drew him deeper into the labyrinth, closer to power. Farther from the boy who once carried oranges to towns in hopes of earning a few pesos. The world of the cartels was dangerous, but danger was familiar to him. Hunger had been dangerous. Soldiers had been dangerous. Poverty itself had been dangerous. The risks of smuggling were only a new language for an old reality. And so he carried himself with calm, unshaken by threats that might have rattled others. By the end of these early years, one could sense the inevitability of what would follow. The soil of Sinaloa had given him roots. Now the trade was giving him direction. He was no longer merely surviving the mountains. He was navigating corridors that stretched beyond them, from fields of poppies to airstrips in the desert, from backroom deals to whispers in guarded mansions. His world was expanding. He was not yet the kingpin, not yet the figure who would command tunnels and armies. But he was becoming something more than a mule, more than a courier. He was becoming indispensable, and in the world of shadows, indispensability was the first step toward power. The chapter of apprenticeship closed softly, without fanfare. No great victories marked it. No legendary tales. Only the slow, deliberate accumulation of trust, of knowledge, of patience. And perhaps that was the truest beginning of Joaquín Guzmán Lora's rise. Not a moment of spectacle, but the steady, invisible climb of a man who knew that the most powerful wings are those unfolded in silence. The 1990s arrived like a quiet storm. In the wake of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's arrest, Mexico's criminal landscape splintered into fragments. What had once been a single federation of traffickers, the Guadalajara cartel, fractured into rival clans, each scrambling to claim a share of the trade routes, the plazas, the corridors that funneled narcotics north into the United States. It was in this shifting landscape that Joaquín Guzmán Loera El Chapo began to carve his own path. Unlike others, who declared their presence with bullets, bribes, and grand spectacles, Guzmán preferred shadows. He was not a man to roar. He was a man to whisper, and in those whispers, in that restraint, an empire began to take shape. The first foundations were dug not above the earth, but beneath it. Guzmán became fascinated, some said obsessed, with the potential of tunnels. Where others saw roads guarded by soldiers and checkpoints filled with risk, he saw the hidden arteries of the land itself. A tunnel was more than an escape. It was a promise of permanence. It allowed contraband to flow unseen, uninterrupted, and it turned the ground beneath his enemies into a silent battlefield he alone controlled. Imagine this scene: dimly lit corridors carved beneath border towns, concrete reinforced, lit by naked bulbs that hummed faintly with electricity. Ventilation systems breathed stale air through the caverns, while rails carried carts of cargo from one end to the other. Above, the desert sun scorched the earth. Below, the empire of Guzmán expanded in silence. But tunnels were only one piece of his architecture. On the surface, the cartel that would become known as Sinaloa grew through patience. Trucks rolled slowly across desert roads, their tires grinding against dust and stone. Safe houses appeared in quiet neighborhoods, indistinguishable from the homes around them, humble walls concealing millions in contraband and cash. His rivals measured their success in gunfire and notoriety. Guzmán measured his in routes secured, shipments completed, and risks avoided. He understood something few others did. Survival was not about being the loudest predator. It was about becoming invisible, a presence felt but not seen. Psychologically, this required both paranoia and patience. Guzmán trusted almost no one, yet those he did trust served him with extraordinary loyalty. His men often said he possessed an unusual gift. He inspired devotion not through charisma, but through his unshakable aura of inevitability. He gave the impression that to follow him was to belong to something larger than oneself, something that would endure long after others had fallen, and so, piece by piece, Sinaloa expanded. Every new smuggling corridor was not seized in an explosion of violence, but absorbed in silence, as if the earth itself were handing it over. Every rival who underestimated him discovered too late that invisibility was not weakness, it was strength, the kind that could suffocate louder, brasher men. In the mid-1990s, while Colombian cartels burned bright with spectacular violence, Guzmán's cartel remained nearly invisible. News headlines spoke less of his name than of the chaos around him. Assassinations in Tijuana, blood in Juarez, betrayals in Guadalajara. To the world beyond Mexico, Guzmán was still little more than a rumor, a figure whispered about in border towns and intelligence circles, but not yet the specter he would become. And yet, those inside the game already felt his presence. Competitors muttered about his endless patience, his refusal to be provoked. Authorities puzzled over shipments that vanished without a trace. As if absorbed into the desert itself, the empire of Guzmán was not built in sudden strokes. It was a slow tightening of invisible threads, a network of alliances, family ties, and calculated silences. The unremarkable man from the hills of Sinaloa, once a subordinate, now moved chess pieces across an entire country. What he created was not flamboyant, nor did it strive for glory. Instead, it was practical, enduring. Like the tunnels he loved, it was dug deep into the earth, designed to last, designed to resist collapse. But silence, contains its own contradictions. Power built in the shadows carries within it the seeds of paranoia. Guzmán's trust was never absolute. His nights were restless, his mind constantly scanning for betrayal. He lived surrounded by men he trusted with his life, yet he never forgot that loyalty was fragile, that empires built on fear and silence could shift without warning. Still, he pressed on, and with each passing year, the balance of Mexico's underworld tilted further in his favor. By the late 1990s, whispers of Guzmán's network reached beyond Mexico. American authorities began to notice patterns they could not trace. Shipments that slipped through unseen, fortunes accumulated in silence. They began to realize that while others sought spectacle, one man had chosen invisibility, and invisibility was proving far more dangerous. And so, a reflection, the Colombian cartels of the 1980s burned like fire. They declared war on governments, assassinated presidents, unleashed terror that seared itself into history. But fire consumes itself. It blazes brightly, then collapses into ash. Guzmán's Sinaloa cartel was different. It was not fire, it was shadow. A kingdom without spectacle, without crowns, without banners. It grew unseen, stretching its roots across deserts and borders, until one day the world looked around and realized the shadow had covered everything. What began as tunnels and whispers had become an empire, and though cracks already hid beneath its walls, though paranoia gnawed at its heart, the silence around it felt unshakable. In the 1990s, Guzmán was no longer merely a player in Mexico's criminal landscape. He had become its architect, and the world was beginning to take notice. There is a particular silence that lingers after a door closes, a silence filled not with peace, but with the weight of something that has just slipped away for Joaquín Guzmán Loera. The years of the late 1990s and early 2000s became defined by such silences. His empire grew, stretching like shadows across the continent, but so too did the hunt against him. Each escape, each narrow evasion of capture, was not the thunderous chase of cinema, but something quieter, stranger, almost anticlimactic. The authorities arrived with noise sirens echoing through the night, helicopters slicing the air above dusty towns, boots striking against concrete. But Guzmán's responses were never loud. They were whispers of movement, the rustle of a curtain, the faint creak of a hidden door. He had built an empire on invisibility, and now, in these years of pursuit, that invisibility became his shield. Imagine the scene, soldiers bursting into a house in Sinaloa, their flashlights cutting across empty rooms, mattresses still warm, cigarettes half burned in ashtrays. In the bathroom, a trapdoor lies open, water dripping faintly against cement, leading into darkness. By the time boots descend the ladder, the man they sought is already gone, his figure swallowed by the earth. These were years of fire and flight. Alliances shifted like desert winds. Rivals plotted, friends betrayed, and governments pressed closer. Yet Guzmán moved through it with a paradoxical calm. His patience remained his greatest weapon. Where others would panic at the first sign of pursuit, he calculated, he waited, and then he slipped away. There were whispers of him vanishing through tunnels barely large enough for a man to crawl. Rumors of him leaving haciendas moments before raids. The engines of his convoys fading into the night as helicopters thundered above empty fields. Even when captured, the story was not over. Prison walls, meant to contain him, became merely another obstacle. In 2001, Guzmán's most famous escape unfolded in silence. The official record describes a laundry cart pushed across the prison floor, wheels squeaking faintly against tile. Guards passed it by, unknowing, their eyes searching elsewhere. Beyond those walls, beyond the layers of steel and stone, waited freedom. It sounds almost absurd, almost cinematic in its simplicity. And yet, that was his gift, the ability to turn the impossible into the inevitable, not through force, but through patience, cunning, and silence. But beneath these escapes lay a deeper contradiction. The man himself. Guzmán lived with an odd mixture of modesty and excess. In public, he avoided flamboyance. Unlike some of his rivals, who sought attention with gold-plated weapons and lavish mansions, he preferred discretion. Yet, behind closed doors, he craved control. He nurtured complex relationships, tangled in secrecy, woven with both affection and fear. He could be generous, almost tender, with those closest to him, and yet he was ruthless in business, unwilling to forgive betrayal, unwilling to share what he believed was his by right. To his followers, he was both protector and master. To his enemies, he was a phantom that eluded every grasp. The years moved quickly, each season marked by another chase, another escape. His legend grew, not in the flashes of gunfire, but in the echoes of absence. Each time authorities closed in, he was already elsewhere, moving through mountains, disappearing into villages, concealed by a network that stretched deeper and wider than outsiders could comprehend. But with growth came pressure. With each escape, the noise of the hunt grew louder. Governments on both sides of the border poured resources into finding him. His enemies, resentful of his dominance, whispered alliances into existence. The walls of silence he had built held strong, but they trembled with the weight pressing against them. Psychologically, these years carved away at him. Paranoia, once a tool, became a constant companion. He trusted few, and even those few only conditionally. Nights were restless. Dreams were broken by the sound of imagined boots on gravel, imagined knocks at the door. And yet he pressed forward. The paradox of his life deepened. A man both hidden and omnipresent, modest in manner but vast in reach, feared and yet strangely invisible. The pursuit was relentless. In one raid, soldiers stormed a compound only to find plates of food still warm, the steam curling into the air. In another, his convoy of trucks melted into the mountains, leaving behind only tire tracks that the wind soon covered with dust. Each time, it was the same pattern: noise chasing silence, spectacle grasping at shadow. These escapes were not romantic victories. They were exhausting acts of survival. Each flight bought him more time, but it also deepened the sense of inevitability. For how long could silence shield a man pursued by so many? How long could tunnels and whispers defy the fire that raged outside? By the end of these years, unease settled like a weight upon his empire. The Sinaloa cartel remained powerful, its roots dug deep across continents, but cracks had begun to show. Betrayals simmered beneath the surface. Authorities refined their tactics, their patience beginning to mirror his own. And Guzmán himself, though still untouchable, carried within him the strain of a life always in motion, always glancing back at doors left ajar. And so this chapter closes with reflection. The years of fire and flight were not years of triumph, though they added to his legend. They were years of exhaustion, of restless nights and endless pursuit. The world began to know his name not because he stood in the light, but because each time it reached for him, it grasped only shadows. Silence had carried him far, but even silence, under relentless fire, begins to fracture. The question lingered like smoke in the air. How long can a man vanish before the world finally catches him? There is a strange moment when shadows become too large to ignore. A man who once belonged only to the mountains, to the hidden roads of Sinaloa, now appeared on the pages of magazines and newspapers across the world by the late 2000s. Joaquín Guzmán Lara was no longer just a fugitive. He was a symbol, feared, admired, hunted. His name was whispered in corridos, sung in cantinas, printed in the bold type of international press, and recited in intelligence briefings inside governments that struggled to trace his reach. And yet, for all this visibility, the man himself remained unseen. A paradox. The ghost who had become famous in 2009, Forbes magazine listed him among the world's billionaires. To the outside world, the idea was both shocking and strangely inevitable. Here was a man raised in the dust of Sinaloa, a boy who had once carried bundles of poppies on his back, now ranked alongside industrialists and bankers. Wealth, in this context, was not born of invention or commissary, flowed from rivers of narcotics. Invisible yet relentless, cutting across continents. But for Guzmán, this recognition was dangerous. His power had always been rooted in silence, in invisibility. To be seen, even in the abstract light of numbers and rankings, meant that the world's gaze had shifted. He was no longer only the enemy of law enforcement. He was now a global obsession. The reach of the Sinaloa cartel in these years stretched far beyond Mexico. Cocaine moved north into the United States through hidden tunnels, concealed compartments in trucks, and corrupt officials at borders. Methamphetamine laboratories spread like hidden furnaces across valleys and deserts. South America became both supplier and ally, while Europe opened new markets hungry for the product. The roots were invisible threads woven across oceans and continents. Lines of power drawn not on maps, but in the flow of money, drugs, and silence. To understand the scale of it is to imagine an underground river, one that moves unseen beneath nations, feeding countless hands, drowning others. That river had a name, and though it was built on networks far larger than one man, the world called it El Chapo's. Myth began to rise around him, as it often does when facts are scarce. In villages across Sinaloa, songs praised his cunning, his generosity, his defiance of authority. Stories circulated of him paying for medicine, for food, for weddings. These tales painted him as a Robin Hood figure, a protector of the poor against the neglect of the state. But alongside those stories ran darker ones, whispers of retribution, of those who crossed him vanishing into the earth, of loyalty demanded and enforced by fear. The legend grew two faces. To some, he was a hero. To others, a phantom who brought death in silence. What is striking about this period is not only the scale of his empire, but the way he lived beneath it. Guzmán did not stride through public squares or bask in the light of fame. He remained hidden, moving through safe houses, mountains, and tunnels. Photographs of him were rare, sightings rarer still. The louder the myth became, the quieter the man remained. This paradox deepened his aura. Governments could track the flow of billions, could map the spread of his cartel across continents, and yet they could not put their hands on him. He was both everywhere and nowhere, his absence more powerful than presence, but notoriety is its own kind of trap. The louder the world spoke his name, the harder it became to remain unseen. Every corridor of silence narrowed. Authorities adapted, alliances shifted. His myth became fuel for governments determined to prove their strength, to show that no man could be larger than the law. For Guzmán, the attention was double-edged. It solidified his legend, but it also drew the walls tighter around him. Psychologically, these years demanded even greater secrecy. Paranoia was no longer a precaution. It became a necessity. Trust shrank to a small circle. He moved often, never lingering in one place, knowing that eyes were everywhere. Nights grew heavier with unease, as each sound, a car backfiring, a helicopter overhead. A knock at the door could signal the end of silence. And yet, he remained calm, patient. His strategy had not changed: to wait, to endure, to let others burn themselves out in noise while he stayed hidden in shadow. He had built his empire not on spectacle but on tunnels, on patience, on silence. Even now, as the world called him the most wanted man alive, he leaned on the very lessons learned in the mountains of his childhood. There is a weight to being a legend while still alive. Guzmán became both man and myth, and the two began to blur. In some ways, he was trapped by his own reputation. Every song sung in his honor, every article written about his billions, every whispered story in the streets of Culiacán added another brick to a prison of visibility. The paradox tightened. To remain powerful, he had to remain invisible. But the more powerful he became, the more visible the world made him. Maps of the time show borders drawn in lines of ink, but his world was mapped in secrecy. Invisible corridors through mountains, routes across seas, networks of money laundering that wove through banks in cities far from Sinaloa. Governments called him a threat to nations, a destabilizing force. To his followers, he was proof that one of their own could rise from dust to dominate the globe. But to Guzmán himself, perhaps he remained, at his core, the boy from the Sierra Madreses, picious, cautious, always moving through hidden paths. Wealth and notoriety had changed the world's gaze, but they had not erased the silence within him. And so the chapter closes with a reflection by the late 2000s. El Chapo Guzmán was a name known in every corner of the world. He was listed among billionaires, sung about in ballads, cursed in government offices, whispered about in safe houses. Yet, in truth, he remained unseen, a ghost more powerful than governments, more present in absence than in presence. The paradox endures. How can a man be both everywhere and nowhere? How can silence be louder than any voice? The world's most wanted man was not caught in this moment. He was still out there, still vanishing, still shaping his empire in shadow. But even shadows cannot remain forever unbroken. Asterisk. There are places in this world that exist only in shadows. Places where light struggles to breathe, where sound carries differently, where time itself feels altered. For Joaquín and Chapo Guzmán, those places were not dungeons or cells, but sanctuaries. Tunnels, long, dark, and hidden, became the arteries of his empire, and, in a way, they became the story of his life. Imagine the air below ground, heavy, damp, tinged with the metallic taste of soil. Every step echoes softly, swallowed by narrow passageways. Somewhere above, life continues. Traffic rolls across highways. Farmers till their fields. Children play in dusty courtyards. But down here, in the secret chambers beneath the earth, Guzmán's world thrived. These tunnels were not crude holes dug in desperation. They were feats of clandestine engineering, electric light strung along ceilings, rails for moving shipments, ventilation systems ensuring air flowed smoothly. Each one represented foresight, planning, obsession. The world saw drugs. Guzmán saw logistics. The world saw walls. He built routes around them. It was never just about moving cargo. The tunnels carried symbolism as much as they carried contraband. For Guzmán, they reflected control. Above ground was Police patrols, rival cartels, helicopters circling like vultures. Underground, there was order. There was silence. There was invisibility. A tunnel was both refuge and escape hatch, a place where the chaos of the surface dissolved into carefully plotted geometry. Observers would later say he had an obsession. They were right. The soil became his canvas, and with each excavation, he redrew the borders of power. When authorities sealed one route, another was already being carved somewhere else. It was as if he thought in layers of earth, each plan existing not in open air, but in the concealed arteries beneath it. His empire expanded not only across borders, but beneath them. Consider what it means to live this way, always tunneling, always seeking cover. It is not just a strategy, but a philosophy. The tunnel is not merely escape, it is existence. Above ground, he was hunted. Below, he was a ghost. Perhaps this is why he trusted the earth more than people. Walls could be breached, loyalty could waver, promises could crumble. But soil, when shaped carefully, remained. The tunnels were not only practical, they became legend. Stories spread of passages linking entire towns, of exits that opened into quiet bedrooms or hidden barns. Some swore the tunnels ran like rivers under the border itself, carrying shipments north and riches south. To the poor who admired him, this ingenuity became another sign of his brilliance, a man who could outwit armies with a shovel and a plan. But to his enemies, and to governments around the world, these tunnels were a nightmare proof that their walls, their checkpoints, their fences were illusions, and yet every tunnel carried within it a paradox. It offered freedom, but it also dug him deeper into captivity of another kind. The more he relied on hidden paths, the more he sealed himself off from the open air of ordinary life. Freedom became synonymous with secrecy, invisibility, and silence. Each new escape was also another layer of entrapment. This obsession culminated in 2015. It was not the first time Guzmán had slipped away from confinement, but it was the most extraordinary and perhaps the most symbolic. Inside the prison at Altiplano, cameras recorded his every move. Guards kept watch, convinced the walls were impenetrable. But beneath the surface, in silence and darkness, another world was being carved. Workers labored for months, guided by engineers who mapped precise measurements from outside the compound. Machines hummed deep in the earth, their sounds muffled by layers of soil. And slowly, a passageway emerged, over a mile long, ventilated, fitted with rails, and even a motorbike for swifter escape. It was less a tunnel than an underground highway, designed not for desperation but for certainty. On that July night, Guzmán slipped into his shower cell. The cameras recorded him bending down, and then back. Where moments earlier there had been a prisoner, now there was nothing but empty tile. The world above was stunned. Authorities scoured hallways, guards shouted, alarms rang. But by then, Guzmán was already far beneath them, riding quietly through a passage of his own making. Above ground, chaos. Below, silence. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Even in the heart of a maximum security prison, even under the weight of the state itself, he had found his element. The earth opened, and he disappeared once more. Yet, there is something haunting in this triumph. For while tunnels represented ingenuity, they also revealed fragility. Each escape deepened the myth, but also intensified the hunt. The louder the world spoke his name, the narrower his paths became. He could vanish for a night, for a month, for a year. But tunnels, no matter how long, always end somewhere. And so we are left with the paradox of the Tunnel King, a man who trusted shadows more than sunlight, who sought refuge not in fortresses but in soil. His empire was built on hidden arteries, his freedom preserved by passages invisible to the eye. Yet the very act of tunneling, of forever moving underground, revealed his fate. He could escape walls, but never the circle of his own legend. Every tunnel curved back toward him. Every passage, no matter how deep, was another echo of silence, another step toward inevitability. Perhaps that is why the image endures. Not the man himself, but the idea of him crouched in darkness, hand against damp soil, listening for the faint hum of freedom. Above ground, the world shouts his name. Below, there is only silence. The silence he trusted. The silence that both saved him and buried him. It was January 2016, and the chase had been going on for decades. The world had grown accustomed to hearing his name whispered like a spell, Joaquín Guzmán Loera. El Chapo, to some, he was a phantom too clever to be caught. To others, he was a man already doomed, dragging behind him a legend too heavy to carry forever. The final act began in Los Mochis, a coastal city in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. On the surface, it was an unremarkable place, low houses, the smell of fried fish drifting from kitchens, the hum of ordinary life. Yet beneath that ordinariness, threads of surveillance and intelligence had been tightening. Pulling toward one final knot, Guzmán had been hiding in a modest house, not a fortress, not a palace. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps it was arrogance. The man who once burrowed through the earth with a network of tunnels now rested almost in plain sight. The walls were thin, the rooms narrow. Above ground, there was no silence, only exposure. When authorities closed in, the world expected spectacle. People imagined helicopters slicing the sky, barricades erupting in gunfire, a cinematic clash worthy of the myth. But in truth, it was quieter than anyone could have predicted. Yes, there was a brief exchange of shots, a scattering of chaos. But when it came down to the moment itself, when Guzmán was pulled from his refuge, there was no thunder. Only the slow inevitability of footsteps, of doors opened and closed, of a man being led away. And so, the great Tunnel King, the man who once vanished from prison through a mile-long artery carved in silence, was taken not underground but above ground, handcuffed, exposed, surrounded by soldiers and police whose boots struck against the pavement in a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. The irony was sharp. His life had been a series of escapes, each one outwitting the last. The earth itself had bent to his will, swallowing him when he wished to vanish, spitting him back when it suited him to return. And yet here he was, under the bright sky, surrounded by the eyes of the world, unable to disappear. The silence he had once commanded was still present. But now it was not freedom, it was resignation. The world looked on, expecting fireworks, but what unfolded was closer to an echo, an ending stripped of drama, almost mundane. Because in truth, The myth had long since escaped him. The ballads sung in his honor, the tales whispered of his cunning, the stories of generosity and vengeance, they had taken on lives of their own. Even in chains, even in custody, Guzmán remained larger than life, because the myth was no longer his to control. There is a strange loneliness in such a fate. To become a symbol greater than the self is to lose oneself entirely. The man in handcuffs was small, tired, older than the legend remembered. The weight of time showed in his face, in the set of his shoulders. This was not the phantom who bent nations to his will. This was a man receding into silence. The capture did not end anything. It only changed the scenery. For Guzmán, it meant the narrowing of horizons, the open skies traded for concrete ceilings, the tunnels of freedom replaced by prison corridors. For the world, it was another chapter in a story that seemed to regenerate itself endlessly, no matter how many times it was declared finished. Inside the prison, the sounds shifted. Gone was the hum of freedom, the subtle vibrations of earth beneath his feet. Instead, there was the metallic echo of boots against concrete floors, the cold clang of iron doors closing, the sterile smell of disinfectant. Each sound carried a finality he could not undo. The silence here was heavier, different from the tunnels he had once trusted. It was a silence that confined, not liberated. One can imagine the moment the door shuts, the key turns, and the cell settles into stillness. The man who had lived in constant motion was now surrounded by immobility. No soil to dig through, no hidden passage to vanish into. Just walls, immovable and plain, holding him in place. The irony deepens when one considers his life's work. For decades, Guzmán had been building exits, always another path, always another escape. But in the end, the final capture was not about being outmaneuvered in some elaborate chase. It was about inevitability. The circle of myth had tightened around him until there was nowhere left to run. And so his story bent back on itself. The man who once commanded silence as his greatest weapon was now trapped in it. The same quiet that had hidden him from governments and rivals was the quiet of his downfall. This silence was not of his choosing, but of the state's. The legend continues, of course. Even as he sat in his cell, the myth walked freely. Corridos were still sung, his name still spoken with awe or dread. To the poor, he remained the figure who had mocked authority. To governments, he remained the embodiment of the war they could not seem to win. But to himself, in that stark cell, he was just a man in silence. There is something profoundly human in this contrast. We imagine endings to be dramatic, thunderous, filled with spectacle. But more often, endings arrive in whispers. A door closing, a pair of footsteps fading, the hollow echo of a name that once shook the world. Perhaps that is the true shape of his story. Not the shootouts, not the riches, not the tunnels carved like veins beneath the earth, but this moment, simple, inevitable, unadorned. A man led away, the myth lingering behind him, still larger than the body it was built upon. And so, the final capture was not a climax, but a quiet descent. The silence did not vanish. It merely changed sides. Once his ally, now his jailer. Once his protection, now his prison. In Los Marches, the air returned to ordinary life. Families prepared meals, children returned to play, the sun set as it always had. But for Guzmán, the world had narrowed to a corridor, a cell, and the silence he could no longer command. The silence endures. But this time, it is not his. Asterisk exile is not always a distant land. Sometimes it is a narrow room, a barred window, a place where silence is no longer chosen but imposed. For Waku, Unguzum, Laurel, Chapatha exile began not with his extradition to the United States, but in the moment he was taken from the soil of Sin. It was the severing of a man from his terrain, from the earth that had once swallowed him whole. In January of 2017, a year after his final capture, he was placed on a plane and carried across borders he once defied. The journey was unremarkable in appearance. A prisoner transferred, another name in a ledger. Yet for Guzmán, it was the collapse of a world. The tunnels, the mountains, the trusted silences of Homewall were behind him. Ahead lay a country that had pursued him for decades, a stage he never wanted to stand on. In New York, the trial became a spectacle. Journalists gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, voices echoing through the cold air. Inside, witnesses spoke former allies, rivals, insiders who had once shared bread and secrets with him. They recounted his empire in vivid detail. The tunnels, the shipments, the betrayals. Piece by piece, the myth was dissected under fluorescent light. And yet, through it all, Guzmán remained. Guzmán remained mostly silent. He sat behind glass, expression guarded, his words scarce. For a man who once shaped his world through shadows, silence had been power. Now silence was his only option. It was no longer chosen, but forced. The difference was profound. The paradox of visibility and invisibility sharpened. Here was a man the world had hunted, a figure whose face was stamped on wanted posters, whose name filled headlines across continents. And yet, in that courtroom, he seemed diminished, almost spectral. He was present, undeniably so, yet he carried the aura of absence. It was as if the myth had grown so large it no longer needed him. The legend lived outside those walls, while the man sat quietly within them. Power is never still. It moves, flows, changes hands. While Guzmán endured the weight of trial, others took up the work of survival. The Sinaloa cartel did not vanish with its leader. It adapted, as organisms do when threatened. New names rose, new hands reached for the reins. The machinery of power, once oiled by his paranoia and patience, found fresh operators. The silence of one man could not silence an entire empire. Still, the cultural presence lingered. His name was sung in corridos, the ballads of the borderlands. His image appeared in films, in novels, in whispered stories told in cantinas. For many, he remained a symbol of rebellion, of defiance, of survival against overwhelming odds. And yet, for Guzmán himself, the reality was smaller. A bed, a chair, a narrow space to pace. The quiet routine of captivity. There is an ache in such contrasts. To hear one's name sung while one's body is confined. To live as both legend and prisoner. The echoes of the myth reach far, but inside they die against the walls. The man who once lived beneath the surface of the earth, carving secret roots of freedom, now found himself beneath the weight of a system that allowed no exits. There were no tunnels here, no shadows to slip into, only light that exposed and silence that suffocated. The psychology of Guzmán in exile invites reflection. What happens when a man who trusted silence above all is forced into endless quiet, when stillness is no longer strategy but cage? The silence that once gave him power now stripped him of it. It pressed in from all sides, a reminder that freedom and control had slipped away. Outside, the world moved on. The drug war shifted. Attention turned to new battles, new figures. The legend of El Chapo remained in circulation, but a symbol rather than command. Power had flowed elsewhere, as it always does. Like water, it found the next lowest point, the next open channel. For Guzmán, power was no longer a tool in his hands. It was a memory, one he could not touch. In this paradox, we see the fleeting nature of power. It shines brilliantly for a time, but it never holds still. It is borrowed, not owned. Even those who seem untouchable are eventually reduced to silence. The myth can outlive the man, but the man himself becomes smaller, quieter, fading into the corners of history. Perhaps that is the truest exile, not the movement from one land to another, but the separation between the self and the story. The myth continues its life, vibrant and restless, while the figure it once adorned sits motionless, fading. For Guzmán, the exile was not death. It was something more haunting. It was to be alive while the myth lived louder than he could, to exist as both presence and absence, to sit in silence while the world still spoke his name. And so the story lingers. In prison, the days pass slowly. Outside, the legend remains quick, sharp, alive. He is both here and not here, both real and ghost-like, a shadow in exile, waiting in silence. The silence endures, but it is no longer his to command. Beneath the soil of northern Mexico, where dust drifts like smoke and the sun burns mercilessly on the surface, there are tunnels that still exist. Some collapse with time, their walls crumbling into themselves. Others remain intact, secret arteries winding through earth, silent and unmarked, stretching beneath towns and fields. They were carved by hands working in shadows, men who moved. Dirt, as though they were building not just passageways but worlds. These tunnels are quiet now, abandoned, yet they hold an echoer, faint memory of the footsteps that once rushed through them, of whispered orders carried like wind, of a freedom built beneath the surface of law. El Chapo's name is tied to them, inseparable. The tunnels were his language, his architecture, his strategy of survival. To the world above, he was a fugitive, a kingpin, a ghost slipping through walls. To the world beneath, he was a builder of silence. In them, he reversed the natural order, the earth into shelter, the underground into escape. They became metaphors for his life, unseen, unmeasured, always flowing away from the eyes that sought him now. In a prison far from those tunnels, his silence is not chosen but enforced. He is a man caged, stripped of movement, while his creations remain. Somewhere, a tunnel still breathes faint draughts of air. Somewhere, a forgotten passage still stretches toward light. And in that contrast, his legacy lingers. The story of El Chapo is not the story of a single man. It is the story of a hidden economy, a subterranean world that threads itself through nations. It is about how power thrives, not always in noise, in spectacle, or in headlines, but in quiet places where few look, where silence reigns. His tunnels mirrored the system he belonged to, unseen, yet shaping the lives of millions. Invisible, currents that run beneath the ordinary, altering the world above without ever being acknowledged. There is a paradox in endings like this. On the surface, the figure is captured, locked away, stripped of influence. But beneath, the structures remain, the networks, the roots, the myths. The man is gone from the stage, but his silence endures. In the soil, in the memories of those who lived in its shadow, in the songs that still carry his name. Think of the markets in Sinaloa, where vendors still lay out fruit in the morning sun, where children laugh in the dusty streets. Above, life is ordinary. Below, invisible histories stretch like roots. They do not speak, but they exist, as constant as the earth itself. That is the paradox. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of what cannot be said aloud. El Chapo once controlled silence, commanded it. He lived in its depths, slipping between noise and shadow. But now, silence commands him. The world has moved forward. Other names rise in whispers, other networks adapt, other men slip into his role. Yet his myth remains suspended, caught between presence and absence, alive in culture but fading in reality. In this final meditation, we return not to the man, but to the earth. Imagine standing at the mouth of one of his tunnels, abandoned, its air heavy and still. The light does not reach far, shadows gather like water. Every sound is amplified, the drip of moisture, the shuffle of your own shoes. You feel the weight of earth above you, pressing down, and you realize these tunnels were not only escape routes, they were symbols of defiance against the surface world, of freedom carved from soil, of silence turned into strength. But even tunnels age, even silence shifts. They collapse, they erode, they fill with dust, and the men who made them become memories, myths carried in songs, stories whispered across borders. The silence beneath the world never disappears, but it changes its form. For El Chapo, the tunnels are no longer passages of escape. They are monuments, silent, hidden, invisible markers of a paradoxical life. A man who built freedom underground now ends in captivity. A man who commanded silence now listens to its weight. A man who vanished and reappeared like a ghost now remains where the walls will not open. And yet, silence does not belong to him alone. It lives on, not in his cell, but in the systems he embodied, in the unseen economies that persist, in the unspoken rules that govern places where law and survival blur, in the myths that children still hear, not knowing where truth ends and story begins. This is not a tale of justice, not a tale of triumph. It is a tale of paradox. A man is buried alive by history, yet his echoes continue. His silence is both an ending and a beginning. His tunnels remain beneath the soil, hollow and unseen, waiting for footsteps that may never come. Somewhere deep underground, the earth remembers him. The walls remember the scrape of shovels, the sound of laughter muffled in dirt, the rushing footsteps of escape. Now they are empty, their silence uninterrupted. But silence, once born, rarely dies. It lingers, reshaping itself, moving through time like an unseen current. So we leave El Chapo where he is, in a prison cell, his myth larger than his body, his silence deeper than his voice. We leave him in paradox, a ghost who once lived beneath the world, now fading within its walls. And we leave ourselves with the lingering truth. Power may rise and fall, men may vanish into history, tunnels may collapse and myths may fade, but silence endures, like the earth beneath our feet, unseen yet unyielding, like the tunnels stretching still beneath the world.